Hello and welcome back to my channel. So at the end of this month, March, there is a significant date in the Bronte calendar because on the 31st of March 1855 Charlotte Brontë died. This year, 2026, marks the 171st year since that day. Now, I don't want to focus on a death today because I covered that recently when I looked at how the Bronte family lived with death all around them. And I will pop a little link in the description if you want to watch that. Instead, I want to take a slightly different approach because Charlotte Brontë is one of those historical figures where a very strong image has formed over time. Many people picture her as this quiet and this fragile and slightly tragic figure sitting in Haworth Parsonage writing novels while the wind blows dramatically out on the moors. And of course, there is an element of truth in that image. But when you start reading her letters and when you look carefully at the recollection of people who actually knew her, the picture becomes much more interesting, you could say. We see someone observant, determined, something quite sharp in the way that she described the people around her. Someone who clearly had ambition beyond Haworth. But we also see someone very human. Charlotte herself tells us that she was shy. I mean, she worried about how she looked and she had very little experience of the wider social world beyond school and that small circle of friends. And yet, again and again, we see her pushing herself into a situation that must have felt uncomfortable. So, in this video, I want to step back from that image that we often see and ask a slightly different question. What if Charlotte Brontë was not naturally confident at all? What if, like many of us, simply a woman trying to become the person that she hoped she could be? That whole fake it till you make it. So let's settle down, grab a cup of tea. Today I'm exploring St John the Baptist Church here in Stanwick in North Yorkshire. I spent a bit of time in the area and couldn't resist stopping off to look at this beautiful spot. Parts of the church date back to the 13th century, so it's full of history and it really does feel like stepping back in time. So you've probably noticed that some of the filming is indoors and some is outdoors again. Well, do you know what? I actually did all the filming outdoors, but slight technical issue involving a forgotten to charge microphone and a lot of wind when I was there. Put those two together and you have beautiful imagery, but no sound. So I came home, looked through it all and thought, something's not right. So here I am back at home in my corner. Yes, now talking to you all over again. But it was such a beautiful day out there. I'm sure you'll see from the pictures. The sky was blue, but oh, that wind was so cold. So I'm glad to be home because obviously that enables me to sit back and have a cup of tea at the same time. So I know I go on about tea a lot and I apologise for that, but it really is one of my favourite things to do. Right. So should we talk about Charlotte Brontë instead of my terrible tea obsession? One of the first things that becomes clear when you look closely at Charlotte Brontë's early writing career is that she was not simply sitting quietly in Haworth waiting to be discovered. She was trying from the very beginning. And in the mid-1840s, Charlotte and her sisters made a very deliberate decision to enter the literary world. In 1846, they published a small book called Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, obviously using those pseudonyms that have since become so famous. It sold 2 copies, yes, just 2. And for many people, that would have probably been the end of the experiment. But Charlotte had already written a novel, The Professor, and she began sending it out to publishers. Okay, it was rejected many times, but eventually one publisher, Smith, Elder & Co., wrote back with what could easily have felt like criticism. They suggested the manuscript lacked excitement and encouraged her to try something with more movement and feeling. Now, imagine receiving that letter. Charlotte was living in this very small Yorkshire village. She had very little experience of the literary world, and at this point there was just no guarantee that any of the sisters would become successful. It would have been so easy just to stop, put it all away and forget about it. But she didn't. Instead, she took that advice and she started writing again. The novel she wrote next became Jane Eyre. And when it was published in 1847, it was an immediate success. And the following year, Charlotte did something that must have taken real courage. Because in 1848, she travelled to London to meet her publisher, George Smith, in person. She went with her sister Anne Brontë, partly to clear up this confusion about the Bell's pseudonym. But what we have to remember, today that doesn't seem like much at all. But then it was a long journey from a small Yorkshire village into the centre of this bustling London literary world. It was expensive, it was slow, and it would have been far outside Charlotte's normal life. Yet she went. She encouraged Anne to go too. And later, after the deaths of her siblings, she moved even more directly in literary circles. She met writers like William Makepeace Thackeray, and in 1850 she dined at his house in London. Accounts recorded later by Elizabeth Gaskell, she described Charlotte wearing this pale dress with a delicate pattern and her hair arranged in smooth bands, fashionable at that time. A dress that now is at the Haworth Parsonage is associated with that very visit and obviously is sometimes called the Thackeray dress. And although we cannot say for certain that is the very same dress, there's a lot of evidence that says it is. What is interesting is what's happening during that evening. Charlotte did not suddenly become this confident centre of attention. Oh no. Some accounts suggest that she spent much of the evening quietly speaking with the governess rather than trying to dominate the conversation in the room. And that detail to me is important because It reminds us that Charlotte had not suddenly transformed into this confident socialite. She was still very shy and she was slightly uncomfortable. But she went anyway. She pushed herself and she did it. She travelled to London. She met the people who mattered and placed herself in a world she clearly wanted to be part of. And that makes you wonder if confidence, for Charlotte at least, was sometimes something she had to build rather than something that came naturally. The phrase, "fake it till you make it," comes to mind. Another thing that becomes very obvious when you start reading Charlotte Bronte's letters is just how closely she observed people around her. Sometimes that observation is warm, sometimes it's very funny, and occasionally it is quite cutting. One of the best known examples appears in her reaction to the novels of Jane Austen. In 1850, Charlotte wrote to the critic George Henry Lewis, who had suggested she read Pride and Prejudice. Charlotte admitted that she simply could not share the admirations that so many readers felt. And she described Austen's fictional world as being a carefully enclosed, cultivated garden with neat borders and delicate flowers, but with no open country, no fresh air and no blue hills beyond. It's such a vivid image, and whether we agree with her or not, that doesn't really matter. It shows something about how Charlotte approached literature. She was looking for intensity, emotional depth, something less controlled and perhaps a little bit wilder. But the same sharpness appears in much smaller moments as well. In letters to Ellen Nussey, her lifelong friend, we often see much more playful sides of her personality. In one letter, she jokingly scolded Ellen for her handwriting, writing, "I scold you, Ellen, for writing it illegibly and badly." I mean, it's a tiny comment, yes, but it tells us something. Charlotte could tease people that she loved. She could also be surprisingly frank when describing the people that she met. And after meeting the novelist William Makepeace Thackeray, she later wrote privately to Ellen describing him as very ugly indeed. I mean, it's such a wonderful blunt remark, and it just shows how comfortable she felt sharing her honesty and her thoughts with someone that she trusted. I mean, that sense of humour often disappears from that image that people have of her. We tend to picture Charlotte as being very sensible and reserved and almost permanently solemn. But to me, the letters show someone who was watching the world very carefully, someone who noticed people's habits and quirks and occasionally enjoyed a dry little joke about it. If there is one thing that shaped Charlotte Bronte's life more than almost anything else, it was her family. After the death of their mother and the two eldest siblings, the remaining Bronte children became extraordinarily close. That closeness was not simply affection, it was responsibility. Charlotte's adult life is sometimes described as restricted because she spent so much time in Haworth. But when you look closely, what you actually see is loyalty in action. She stayed partly because of her father, Patrick Bronte, because he was ageing and needed his support, but she stayed because Emily and Anne were there. Even after their deaths, the parsonage remained the centre of her world, I mean, we see this clearly in her letters, and in 1849, after the death of Branwell, Emily and Anne, she wrote to Ellen Nussey saying, "I am left all alone with my father, and the house is so silent that I feel every hour more acutely the loss of those I loved. Yet I must continue for their sakes and for his." It is a line that's filled with grief, but also with determination. I mean, the parsonage must have felt painfully quiet, but she did not abandon it. Her loyalty was not sentimental, it was practical. She ensured the household continued to run smoothly. She looked after her father's well-being, and even after her own death, she made sure, through her will of course, that provisions were in place so that he could be cared for. But loyalty did not mean she abandoned her own ambitions. She kept writing. She continued publishing. She travelled when necessary. So again, we see that balance in her life. A woman who cared deeply for the people around her, but she still pushed herself forward when it came to her own work. Yeah, I think I'm doing a bit of that at the moment. Another idea that is grown up around Charlotte Brontë is that she was somehow confined to the parsonage, living her entire life within the narrow world of Haworth. But that simply is not the whole story, because Charlotte was curious about the wider world, and she actively sought opportunities to experience it and get out there. In 1842, she and her sister Emily travelled to Brussels to study at the, and I can never pronounce it so I will put it up here. And for two young women from a modest Yorkshire parsonage, this was a really bold decision. I mean, Charlotte threw herself into her studies. She was learning languages, literature and teaching methods. And then she later returned to the school on her own to work there as a teacher. I mean, these experiences did not just broaden her mind, they provided material that would later appear in novels such as Villette and The Professor. She was observing everything. I mean, her travels took her to places like Edinburgh, where I went recently, in London, and she spent time staying with friends in different households, many of them very different from this very modest world that she had in Haworth. There were grand houses, busy streets, new social circles. I mean, for someone whose everyday life had been sort of centred on Haworth, these experiences must have felt striking. And yet, Charlotte did not avoid them. She stepped into them, even if she kind of sometimes felt really awkward. But she met new people. She maintained friendships across distances. And she formed connections with figures such as Ellen Nussey, her great friend from school, and then of course later Elizabeth Gaskell. So rather than hiding behind the walls of the parsonage, we see Charlotte repeatedly placing herself in unfamiliar situations. Perhaps not always confidently, but willingly. So the question that I have is, how did we end up with this powerful image of Charlotte Brontë as a fragile and permanently shy figure? A great deal of it comes from the earliest biographies written about her. And shortly after Charlotte Bronte's death, Emily Gaskell published The Life of Charlotte Brontë. I mean, it is a fascinating book and contains many valuable insights, if not all are true, but it also shaped a very particular narrative. The quiet, suffering genius living in the parsonage while the winds howled over the moors. And later, writers, journalists and filmmakers reinforced this image. Over time, it became the dominant story. Historians such as Lucas de Miller has described this as part of the Bronte myth, a mixture of truth, exaggeration, and of course selective memory. And like most long-lasting stories, it contains some truth. I mean, we know Charlotte could be shy, she said so herself. She could feel awkward in new situations, don't we all? She was painfully aware of her social position. But those moments were part of her character. And some of the stories often repeated about her shyness also deserves another look. For instance, there is a famous tale that whilst Charlotte was visiting Elizabeth Gaskell in Manchester at her home, Charlotte hid behind the curtains when a visitor arrived. I mean, this is often repeated as proof of extreme shyness. But when you look closely at the context, it seems quite possible that Charlotte was simply joking about the visitor being rather dull. I mean, a small moment of humour gradually turned into a dramatic story of social fear. The image may also have been influenced by her own fiction because, as we know in Jane Eyre, Jane hides behind the curtains to avoid the cruel cousins. And so maybe over time some readers have almost merged the character with the author. But the woman who wrote that scene was also travelling, meeting publishers, dining with famous writers, and of course entering social spaces that must have felt daunting. I mean, when we look at the dinner with Thackeray, I mean, it shows this nuance. Charlotte did not dominate the conversation. But we've got to remember that was not expected of a woman of her background in those times. Instead, she listened, she observed, and she participated carefully. So when we look at the evidence, the picture that emerges is far more interesting than the simple image we often see. Charlotte Brontë was ambitious, perceptive, loyal and witty and quietly determined. Perhaps not confident, but then again, nor are we at times. But she was willing to keep trying and keep pushing. Yay, go Charlotte! Oh, it really felt like spring today, didn't it? Oh, you'll see in the pictures that the sky is blue with the occasional white fluffy cloud here and there. It was beautiful. I had a lovely morning, and when I finished filming, I went and sat in the church and had a bit of chocolate and some drink and just listened. And you could hear the wood creaking as the sun was warming it, and you could hear the pigeons outside. It was just so peaceful. I was also told by a lady I saw walking past the graveyard who said hello, that apparently that church was also used for filming for the film 28 Days Later, or is it 28 Days? I'll look it up and I'll put it here anyway, apparently. So have a look if you know the film, see if you recognise it. Someone had even written in the visitor's book, I came here to see the set from the film. So there you go. But it was beautiful, but so windy, so windy. So yes, I do have tea. We're back to drinking regular tea in a very large mug. This was a gift from a friend in Canada. If she's watching, thank you very much. Still using the mug. So yeah, love a mug. So when we step back and we look at the evidence, the real Charlotte Brontë feels far more vivid than the image that is grown around her. She was not simply the author of Jane Eyre, sitting quietly in the parsonage. She was someone observing the world very closely, someone who worried about how she appeared, who knew she was shy, and who was still stepping into drawing rooms, travelling across countries and pursuing the literary life that she wanted so badly. And in some ways that makes her feel even more relatable, because perhaps Charlotte Brontë was not naturally confident at all. Perhaps she was like many of us. She was simply learning how to become the person she hoped she could be. And I think that version of Charlotte Brontë is far more compelling than the legend. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think Charlotte Brontë is often misunderstood today? And if you heard any Brontë myths that you're not entirely sure are real or not, let me know. Put them in the comments, let's all chat. So thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do the whole likey, subscribey, hypey thing, because it really does help me out and it lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Brontë content. Have a great weekend, take care of yourselves, and I will see you all the Friday after next for more Brontë adventures. I'll see you soon. Bye.